Hello and welcome back to the Reapers. So here we are about to tour the exterior of the Hawker Siddeley Nimrod MR2 stored at Bruntingthorpe by the Cold War Jets collection. We've just passed under the wing of the de Havilland Comet, the original jet airliner, and the aircraft the Nimrod was based upon. A quick comparison of the two will show a shorter fuselage and the addition of the lower fuselage section housing the bomb bay, but the pressurised section, wings and landing gear all came directly from the last Comet models developed. Introduced in the 60s, in the maritime reconnaissance role to replace the Shackleton, it completed over 40 years of service before retirement in 2010. As we approach, the first thing that catches Cap's eye is the lack of a rudder. This was snapped in half during a storm several years ago, but it is now repaired and is currently waiting refitment in the coming months. After that, he notices the frankly enormous flaps in their 60-degree fully down for landing position. This is a very different approach to high lift devices compared to later airliners, but very effective at slowing you down on final approach when you cut the throttle. To quote his original comment, "Those are some serious flaps," as he reaches out to touch them. The Nimrod was a maritime reconnaissance aircraft used for submarine and anti-ship warfare, search and rescue, and a multitude of other duties later on in its career. The lower unpressurised section of the fuselage is entirely new. At the front we have the radome, housing the search water radar, capable of tracking and identifying ships, picking up aircraft, monitoring weather, and even detecting submarine masts at very long range. At the top of the cockpit is the in-flight refuelling probe. Added hastily during the Falklands War, it allowed extended missions from Ascension all the way down to the Falklands themselves, including the longest mission ever flown by Nimrod of 19¼ hours. Initially used to guard Ascension from Argentine attacks, the Nimrod guarded the British task force as it sailed south and provided search and rescue cover to the Black Buck bombing missions. The landing gear is taken almost straight from the Comet 4C, but most of the nose gear here is hidden by the lower fuselage. You can also see the stone guards fitted to prevent debris striking the bottom of the pressure shell in the top of the nose gear bay. Also attached here is the towing bar to allow us to move the aircraft on the ground with the use of a tug. The bomb bay here is the largest single bomb bay of its type on any aircraft, and the upper skin is the Comet's original fuselage. Everything you see additional to that is specifically for the Nimrod, from the stores mounts to the heating pipes, fuel line for the extra internal tanks. Over its career, this bomb bay has carried a multitude of weapons, from anti-submarine torpedoes, harpoon anti-shipping missiles, seaworthy flares, life rafts, even more fuel tanks, containers for deployment should you wish to put some cargo or duty free, that sort of idea in them. And at the top of the range, nuclear depth charges. On the outside is the artwork celebrating 40 years service in 2009, showing the crests of all the squadrons that operated Nimrod over the years. This is the reason for the number 40 being painted on the tail. It's not part of the aircraft's registration number, that is XV 226. Powering the aircraft are 4 Rolls-Royce Spey turbofans, a variant of the same engine which powered the Buccaneer and the Phantom, just without the latter's afterburner, unfortunately. £12,500 of thrust each, which isn't a lot these days, but they do make a much better noise than a modern high bypass turbofan. The vanes that you see Cat pointing to are there to direct the airflow in a specific direction as it enters the engine. The entire shape of the intake is intentionally designed this way to prevent a breakdown in airflow, potential compressor stall and flame out. The main landing gear is again taken from the later Comet models. The very first Comet prototypes had a single main wheel in each leg, but de Havilland quickly replaced these with the 4-wheel bogie on production models. The gear is entirely mechanically operated, sequenced and selected. The only electrics involved are a few microswitches for cockpit indications. What this means is that from the selection of the cockpit lever, unlocking of the geometric lock, retraction of the gear, opening of the door to receive the gear, and subsequent closing of the gear of the door is all achieved through hydraulics, the torque tubes and levers. None of the sequencing is electrically operated. To answer Cap's following question, the large space you're about to see here in the wing is for the gear to retract into. The main leg itself is a very slightly different design to a modern airliner. Those have the shock absorber built into the leg itself. Here we have a separate leg, primary and secondary shock absorber, with a solid leg between them where the beams attach at the bottom for the axles and the wheels and the brake units. Here Cap does some more admiring of the flaps. The pod tanks on each wing are extra fuel tanks carried over again from the later Comet models, adding about an extra £6,500 to the fuel load. On the end of the starboard one, shown here, was a searchlight fitted for search and rescue operations. Capable of lighting up an area at long range to help find ships and life rafts, it consisted of 2 carbon rods with a spark generator between them, focused to a point producing about 70 million candle power. Any maintenance of this required a welder's mask, and it was capable of melting paint off the hangar doors if you happened to leave them closed. On the bottom of the tank, in the black pod, is a small wheel designed to help protect the tank should the aircraft land wheels up, so it doesn't get punctured and you don't have potential fuel leak on your hands. In reality, I think it was more likely that the wheel would just puncture the tank instead. On the end of the wing is the ESM equipment, or the Loral pod. It passively monitors all the incoming signals, such as ground radar, missile radar, and signals like that, and fed the information to the crew. A similar design is fitted to the British version of the Sentry AEW aircraft. Up on the tailplane are extra fins fitted to offset the aerodynamic effects of the refuel probe. If you think you look like aerials, then you are exactly right. Although they aren't used as such and don't send or receive any signals, it was easier to use them rather than design anything bespoke. Very much off the shelf. In front of the flaps, we have the air brakes. These aren't spoilers like you find on most aircraft, and they aren't used on the ground. During flight, they were used to slow the aircraft down without destroying the lift, and there was one on the top of the wing and one on the bottom of the wing. They operated as a pair, with one going into the airflow, going forward, and one going with the airflow, going backwards. They operated as a pair connected in such a way that the one going out with the airflow would help pull out the one that was going into the airflow, and vice versa when being retracted. I did a very simple visual explanation of exactly how this works with my hands, but it hasn't made it into the video. The outboard engines are fitted with thrust reversers, clamshell type doors which would be moved into the jet pipe behind the engine and direct all of the thrust upwards and downwards to help slow the aircraft on landing, similar in concept to the Tornadoes, except that they sit in the jet pipe behind the engine and not on the end of the jet pipe. The jet pipes themselves contain a few other interesting features. At the front, just behind the engine itself, you have the jet pipe temperature sensors telling you how hot the gas coming out of your engine is. And at the end, just in front of the camera here, we have the thrust meter. These probes take a sample of the air coming out the back of the engine and tell you exactly how much thrust your engine is producing. At the back of the lower fuselage are the clamshell doors, affectionately known as the duck's arse. It contains various hydraulic and air conditioning services, and also the sonobuoy launching tube ejector ports, seen here, used during subhanting activities. Before the days of handheld cameras, these doors would open up and allow photos to be taken by internally mounted cameras through windows in the fuselage. The aircraft would fly over a target and the crew would operate them at the right time. The doors were eventually sealed shut when all photos could be taken and seen on board instantly with a digital camera through the lookout windows just behind the cockpit. Further back is the Apu Bay. Unlike almost every other auxiliary power unit in existence, the rover model used here only generates high pressure air for starting the engine. It doesn't give you conditioning air, electrics or hydraulics. It was taken from rover's failed attempt at making a jet turbine powered car, which can now be seen in the London Science Museum. Although it was one APU more than the Comet had, compared to even slightly later models, it was pretty much useless. What you're seeing here are the two inlets and the two exhausts. Both the gas generator side of the APU and the compressor side, which actually provides the high pressure air to start the engines, have their own inlet and exhaust. The hole seen here in the tail is a result of getting the rudder off without having to remove half of the rear section of the aircraft. Obviously this is not how it would have been done in service, but the extra work required, and given the aircraft will never fly again, meant that this was a much easier option. As just to remove the mad boom at the back itself would have been prohibitively time consuming. The panel normally fitted on the bottom here would have contained one of the 3 flare dispensers fitted to the aircraft. Under the engine jet pipes are the inner split flaps. These are sat at the angle selected upstairs in the cockpit, while the plane flaps have drooped down to their full deflection overnight. Without hydraulic pressure to hold them in place, their own weight slowly causes them to droop, but when they're in the fully up position, there are internal locks in the flap servos that hold them in place. These split flaps do not droop because of the different way they are mechanically operated. On the trailing edge of the flaps are 2 fuel jettison pipes, closest to the camera, and a fuel vent pipe just behind them, which are allowed to vent fuel out after expansion in hot weather or just from overfilling the tanks. The pod tank has its own separate fuel jettison pipe, seen here. On both the ailerons and the elevators are fitted balance tabs. These aren't the same as trim tabs. They move in the opposite direction to what the flying control surface itself is moving, allowing the airflow to assist in moving the flying control surface. If the aileron goes down, the balance tab goes up slightly, and the airflow hits this balance tab going up and helps push the aileron down and reduce the mechanical force required to move it. The pylon hard points on the wings here are used for attaching chaff and flare pods, known as BOS pods. These were taken directly from the Tornado, but on a few later models an improved Terma pod was fitted, and this can be seen on the Nimrod parked at Manchester Airport. Some of the Falklands aircraft were also modified at short notice to carry Sidewinder missiles, but it was a very, very limited system with no turn available to the pilots, with just a look and shoot capability if you thought you were flying roughly in the right direction towards your target. This officially made Nimrod the largest fighter in the world. And that, dear viewers, is a fairly short tour of the external side of the Nimrod. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I think Cap had a big smile on his face at the end of this. Thank you for listening.